Wonderful. I wait for a couple of seconds for people to just sit down and the last person's moving in. All right then. So, welcome. We've got 1 hour of the discuss and debate session today before we will relieve you to go for lunch. And I'm very delighted to say that it's not just you here in the audience that I am allowed to welcome. I'm looking now into the camera. Thanks also for everyone who's joining from across the world and is willing to listen to this live stream. We're at RSA Winter Conference and we already had a number of very interesting discussions and a number of sessions, and now you can see it very much, but the room behind you and the camera is filled up with people. So we are looking forward to this session very much. Now, the session, as you can see behind me, is named Skills Gap and Depopulation. This is the two things we are looking at, and we are asking if it's a threat for less developed regions. I'm the moderator, I'm Franziska Wilka, and I'm a professor of urban and regional research at TU Vienna and an affiliated professor of planning and housing at the Department of Land Economy at Cambridge University. And I'm going to be moderating this session. I'm always telling I'm going to be a very harsh presenter, moderator, and I'm cutting off presentations after 10 minutes. That tells you something about the structure of our session today. We've got this hour, we've got 3 presenters, so everyone gets their 10 minutes, and then we should have round about 25 minutes of discussion with you, but also between the panelists. Now, I've said and mentioned panelists, I've said we've got 3, so who are those? So we've got first Louis Dijkstra, who is the head of, now I need to check that I say it correctly, of economic analysts at DG Regio, so that's the Director General for Regional and Urban Policy. So welcome very much. Thank you for joining us from Brussels. Now, we've got Ana Moreno with us, and now I need to check as well, Ana Moreno Monroy. She's at the OECD and joined us today from France, and she's the Regional Inequalities Demographic Change Program Manager. So really the section within the OECD where these really important regional issues are being discussed. So thank you very much for coming from France to join us here in London. And then last but definitely not least, we are welcoming Jouke van Dijk, and I hope I said that roughly correctly, who joined us from the north of Groningen, in the north of the Netherlands, from Groningen University, and he's the professor of regional labor market analysis, and he will be presenting something about brain drain today. But what exactly everyone is speaking about, they will be telling you in greater depth. I'm now starting to introduce the first speaker. We will start off with Louis, who will be presenting on drivers of depopulation and skills gaps. So he'll set a little bit the scene, and then we move on to presentations from Jouke and Anna, and you'll see me in between for a quick moment, but now, Louis, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you all for joining us. I thought the benefit of this topic is that this is probably a topic you've all thought about, you're familiar with, you may have observed in the region that you arrived in, the region that you left. And so I think it's an important topic to grapple with. The interesting thing about it is also that it can have different benefits and costs for different places and different issues over time. So I'm going to just try and give you a quick overview of some of the work that we've done, and we're still working on this to try and understand, is there a role for policy? What should the role of policy? What can we realistically change? And what should we just adjust to or manage? So there's basically 3 issues I want to talk to you about briefly. And so if you look at what comes in the newspapers, you hear a lot of discussion of migration, including in this country, but both concerns about too much immigration, too much out-migration. And so we have seen in the European Union that the working age population has started to shrink, and the usual culprit for that must be migration. And so people with a tertiary education, probably everybody in this room, have a higher propensity to move around. And so lots of people worry that regions with a lot of out-migration are going to see a declining share of tertiary education. And then there's the final assumption that regions with a rapidly shrinking working age population must be suffering economically. right? And you have fewer people who contribute to output, therefore they must be doing worse than other regions. Now, let's take a quick look. What's the cause of population reductions in the EU? Everybody's familiar with the population pyramid. You know, when they first made it, it looked like a pyramid. Now, this one here looks decidedly much more like a mushroom. The reason it looks like a mushroom is because we have an aging baby boom. Probably part of that cohort, but the cohort between 30 and 60 is much, much larger than the cohort between 0 and 30. And so as we age, and you can see those little lines on the side, those are projections. It means that our total population shrinks and our working age population shrinks. So what does that mean? It affects all regions, but it was already affecting rural regions quite a bit more. So you can actually see that already now the majority of people living in rural regions in Europe are experiencing population reduction, but also in urban and intermediate regions, the share of them living in a shrinking region will steadily go up. So here we've decomposed natural change, total population change of the age group 25-64 over the last 5 years. And so all the regions in red are losing population. And then you can see natural change. And there even more regions are in red, which means that the number of people entering that age group is much smaller than the people leaving that age group or passing away. So you can see dark red on the middle map. And then you look at net migration, and it's almost all blue, meaning that almost all regions experience quite a high or quite positive level of net migration for that age cohort. So in virtually all the regions of the European Union, natural change has a much more negative impact on change of that working age population than net migration does. So even if we could influence migration, we wouldn't be solving the underlying problem that we have due to the age cohort effect, a shrinking working age population. And this is also projected to continue. There's a bit of a complicated table, but if you look at the column that says rapidly shrinking population, those are all the regions where you really have a rapid reduction, 0.75 per thousand per year over that 5-year period. You can see that total population change is really negative. It's almost 1% a year, but it's primarily driven by net migration. And the projections for the future, Eurostat projections here, show that the impact will be almost entirely from natural change. And so the net migration in these regions is going to be neutral or even positive. In other regions, if you look at the other regions, you do see that net migration makes a more positive contribution there, but also their natural change is negative. Talking about skills gaps, we can observe large differences in the share of population with a tertiary education in the EU. It's a bit small, but the dots are regions and they're lined up by country. And the big brown dot is the capital region. So if you see a big gap between the brown dot and the other dots, it means that there's a big difference between the capital region and the other regions. In some countries, the gap is relatively small, but if you look at places like Romania or Hungary or Poland, you see a very high rate in the capital region and much lower rate elsewhere. Now, there's two ways that can happen. It can be because everybody with a tertiary education moves to the capital, or it could be people who live in the capital see a much bigger benefit of getting that degree and they're more inclined to get that degree. The difficulty with trying to understand this is we don't have the data at the EU level to distinguish between those two. So our assumption is some movement here, but also some higher propensity in the capital because it's easy, because lots of universities, and because there's a lot of demand for tertiary educated jobs. If we look over time, we actually see it's growing everywhere. So tertiary education, the share is increasing in all regions. And we also see actually it's converging. The gap between regions, between cities and rural areas in tertiary education is shrinking over time relative to the overall share in the EU. But there are a few regions that are not converging and that are lagging. So here, this is a map showing the changes over time. The classes are the same. And you can see that over the past 5 years, almost nobody lost any share of tertiary education. Projections, again, is going to go up virtually everywhere. So despite some of the headlines and the drama, I don't find a lot of drama in the data so far. And this is another one. We have come up with an incredibly implausible scenario. We take everybody in the EU and we send everybody back to the country they're born in. I'm not advocating this, it's purely hypothetical. But we wanted to know what would be the impact on the shared tertiary educated if you do that. And actually those two bars in most countries are incredibly similar. You almost cannot see the difference between those shares. Now, what does that mean? There's two possibilities. Take a country like the Netherlands. Not that many Dutch have moved to another EU member state, so the number is small. There's a slight skill bias because people without a tertiary education are more likely to find a well-paying job in their own country than elsewhere. But because the overall share is relatively small, sending them all back doesn't make much difference. You can have a country like Romania, where the equivalent of 20% of their population in that age group is living in a different member state. So those are big numbers, that's a large share. But there, the skill bias is very small. Of that population that was born in Romania living somewhere else, almost all of them have they have a similar educational profile as the country, people still living in Romania. So if you send them back, yes, total population goes up, but the share of tertiary education remains very, very similar. So mobility between EU countries, it does affect total population and the total number of tertiary educated, but has a very small impact on the share. So if we see differences in share, it's more likely to be because of movement within the country or a different propensity between regions to get tertiary education. Now then the last point, population and economic decline. This is not pretending to be a serious analysis, but this, if you look at a simple regression, you get a cloud, you get a very low R-squared. We see no indication whatsoever that having a population decline actually leads to economic decline. You can do, of course, a more rigorous job and add a lot of controls, but nevertheless, in the end, I'm not convinced that we'll find a large impact, if any at all. This is also because the scale of population change within the EU is relatively small. We're talking about something 0.%, 0.1 or 0.2, whereas economic growth, at least in good times, is measured in full percentage points. So the scale of the two issues is so different that you don't necessarily see a big impact on one of the other. How much time have I got left?
2 minutes.
Oh, I know how to do this. So, I started out with some hypotheses or messages that you see in the media, left and right. Rapid reduction of working age population, clearly driven by migration. It's not the case in the EU. In EU regions, the main cause of reductions in working age population is natural change. You have an aging baby boom, it's not going to change, it's going to get worse, or it's going to get stronger. So we shouldn't pretend that by trying to change migration, or let alone fertility, that we can change these patterns. These patterns are really baked into our current age structure, so we better get used to them and find ways of managing that particular change. The share of tertiary education is growing, it is converging, but some regions are not converging. Not all regions are converging. So for the ones that are really lagging, it is an open-ended question. Will this undermine their capacity for medium-term growth? Will they see a limit on how fast they can converge because there is not highly educated potential labor there? The difficulty is it's not just a supply issue, right? It's also the question, is there the demand in that region for that kind of labor? Are there jobs there that really require people to have a tertiary education? And if there's not, what benefit will we derive from keeping people in that particular location? We don't find a big link between economic and demographic decline, despite the popular narrative that it must be so, or that it makes common sense that there should be such one. And I know that I'm here, making a bit of a dangerous statement. I would tend to agree with certain urban economists that there is a benefit to concentrating tertiary education. I know some people are going to be outraged at this mere suggestion, but data does show that if you concentrate people with a tertiary education, you get more innovation and you get a more productive regional economy. So the desire to reduce that spatial concentration may have some aggregate costs. And I'm not sure the benefits are that clearly defined find to justify trying to aim for such a thing. I do think it's useful to encourage people to finish their secondary education and to acquire a tertiary education, especially when we can easily demonstrate to them that that kind of investment commitment will have a significant benefit to them over their lifetime. And so you need to have jobs available for those kind of educations, either there or elsewhere, to really continue to persuade more people to do so. Then a critical note, there are countries that either subsidize the particular locations or subsidize people moving to particular unpopular location within their countries. I typically don't think of this as an investment. I typically think of it as a very expensive thing to do. And I'm concerned that the benefits of such a policy would be very, very slight. So I can understand it if you're trying to address particular type of job, if you're trying to convince doctors to set up a practice in a rural area and they won't have a lot of patients, it makes sense to compensate them for that. But a general policy is trying to subsidize people to move into areas where they don't want to live is unlikely to produce a lot of benefits in the aggregate or even in that particular region. And remember, it's not migration that's causing the reductions of these population changes. So trying to subsidize and change migration is not going to affect the underlying problem or the underlying trend that we have a shrinking working age population due to the age of baby boom. So started out with some theories, tried to disprove all of them, and I mentioned training you at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis. I can see in some faces you would already like to debate, but before we do that, we will first have a talk from Joke van Dijk. He will be speaking on the long-term consequences of brain drain to depopulation on social and territorial cohesion. While I'll be changing the slides, can I ask you to already move to the speaking place?
Yeah, thank you. No, it's a great pleasure for me to tell something about a case study I did on a request of Lewis. He asked me to do a case study on brain drain for the Netherlands and in comparison with Germany and Denmark. That's very complicated because the data are not exactly the same. So how did I solve this problem together with Lewis? That I said, okay, I will do a study for the Netherlands and ask a German and a Danish colleague to reflect on the outcomes I have, and then we can have some conclusions more general than only for the Netherlands. So what is the outline of my talk? That's the location of the areas with population decline, to give some characteristics and then to give some insight into the processes of brain drain in this particular area. Now, initially, we want to focus on the area in three countries along the coast, which are in all the three countries' peripheral areas. But I focus on the Netherlands and especially on the north of the Netherlands, and there were some regions where were labeled as relevant for policy because of population decline, and mainly the red areas are facing for also quite some time population decline. And there were some policy measures, but the policy measures were more on facilities than on preventing brain drain or try to subsidize people to return to the area. So that was not the issue for the policy, but these were labeled. And I will tell you something about these study area. The areas in the north are close to the coast and to the German border. They face population decline for quite some time, and also the predictions say that this will continue. How long, we don't know, because we see some changes due to COVID, that people work more from home, and this might change migration patterns. There are some indications, but how it will turn out in the long run, we don't know. It's also clear that these particular areas near the coast and near the German border, they have lower employment growth, higher unemployment rates, also lower participation rates, and all other kinds of well-being are less prosperous than in, for instance, the areas around the city of Groningen or some other parts of the country. So there is a problem in these areas with population decline, which is also more than only that the population is declining. Now, what is the underlying processes? I will focus on that now. First of all, the distribution of higher educated. Now, what you clearly see, the dark areas are the areas with a lot of higher educated. Now, for the north of the Netherlands, this is mainly around the city of Groningen and a little bit in Friesland around Leeuwarden. But you see clearly that near the coast and near the German border, it's lighter blue. It means less higher educated. Now, it means also that the brain drain occurs, that people move to the area where a university is located or an applied university, and the elderly and lower educated stay behind in the areas with population decline. Now, what are the underlying processes? This is the so-called escalator model, that the areas, the cities with issues of higher education, they attract people from all over the region. And after graduation, some move to the central areas of the Netherlands. So there is a redistribution of human capital within the region, but also between other regions. Now, when you look at the city of Groningen, you see a typical pattern by age, that at the age of 15, it starts that people are coming in, and after graduation, they move. And when you look at the map, you see blue and red dots. It means the blue dots, these are municipalities who lose population with the city. And the red dots, in the end, they gain, they get more people from Groningen than people are moving from that area to Groningen. So you see, within the north, there is a loss for most municipalities, and some stay in the area around Groningen, and some move to especially Amsterdam. Now, this is the process, what is going on. When you look at more details, we did a study based on microdata, where we have the people at the age of 16 and at 28, and we know where they are located and if they have gained an educational degree. Now, this map shows where people were located at the age of 16, and the left diagram at medium vocational level, you see most of them, this is the area, the level of education which is mostly followed, and it's also quite equally spread. When you look at the most right map for universities, you see that most people who go to university are already located close to the city of Groningen. Why? Because there are also, their parents are highly educated, and parents with highly educated more have children who also go to university. Now, that is what you see in this pattern. And this is where they live at the age of 16. The next map shows where they live at the age of 28. Now, you see in the areas with population decline that a small share of those who go to a university for a university degree, but if they do, also almost 80% of them leave the area and does not come back. Now, we can clearly show this pattern with our analysis. And there is another thing in the area, and when you look at a little bit more broad, that's the University of Groningen. We just saw that a lot of people within the region moved to the city of Groningen to go to university, but more than 50% of the students is coming from outside the north of the Netherlands. So there's also an inflow of talent. And in the first year after graduation, there is still a net gain for the north of the Netherlands. But after 5, 6, 7 years, when they look for their second job, then you get a loss, because the career opportunities in the long run are less. Their partner gets a job somewhere else, because the density of attractive jobs is lower in the north of the Netherlands. So in the end, there is a loss. And you see this also in this graph when you look at the mobility pattern over time. You see Amsterdam on top. Now, Amsterdam attracts a lot of students, and after graduation, it attracts even more. For the city of Groningen, you see that even before graduation, the first leave, because their partner gets a job somewhere else and they finish their master thesis on the place where their partner lives. So these patterns are relevant for the city of Groningen. Now, what to do with it? Universities have policies. The University of the North has now developed a new policy that they will not spread faculties over the country, like for instance now is the case in Denmark, but they want to have hubs, field labs to connect with SMEs all over the place. Now, I think that might be a successful strategy, better than to try to move higher educated back to their home region or to move students because students want to live in a lively city and not in a small village somewhere else. So with regard to this, I think the university has a policy which might work, because I agree with Lewis to force people to go back to their home region or stay there. I think it's not a good option, not for the region and certainly not for the people themselves. So conclusions, regions with population decline in the Netherlands are near the coast and the German border. They have a long history of lagging behind, and this has to do with the educational level, but I think this brain drain occurs and it's very difficult to stop it. And it might even be questionable if this really leads to gains in the long run for the regions as well as for the people. So a substantial amount, the people who go to university in the declining areas, the share is lower, and if they go, they don't come back, they stay where they are or move to the rest of the country. Those with roots in the northern Netherlands, they stay longer and more often, so there is a kind of identity place attachment, but still many of them leave. Now, second conclusion that when the region of the Hill, they attract also talent from other, more than 50% of the students of the University of Groningen comes from outside, even 10,000 students now from abroad, but after graduation they leave. Some policymakers call this brain drain. I try to label it as a clean export product because they come to the city of Groningen, they spend their money, the university is quite big, it's a very big employer, so after graduation they leave. What's the problem? It's a very nice and clean industry. But policymakers are not always convinced. But I think it's good that you try to retain more. But if it's not successful, you still have the benefits that they study in Groningen and spend their money over there. So that's an interesting debate. For the Netherlands, I mentioned the University of Groningen has this policy to establish campuses to connect with the SMEs in the region. And I think this works. It's quite new, but policymakers are of interest, also the local policymakers and the local SMEs. And I saw already some interesting results. Denmark now has established an official policy that they want to relocate, and they force universities to spread out their educational programs over the country. I know some examples in Denmark. I know there's anyone from Denmark here, but it means that some faculties go to small cities of 50,000 inhabitants, and students are not really happy there, staff is not really happy there. So it might be questionable if this policy is successful, but at least they established this policy now officially. For Germany, my colleague could not identify clear policies, only in the type of maintaining facilities like schools, transport. There are some certain subsidies like that, and restructuring the housing market, but not really policies which aim to stop the brain drain or to subsidize people who go back to their home country. That's it.
Well, that was on the dot. So, the next presenter will be Anna Marina Monroy, and she will be speaking about adapting higher education provision to demographic change. Thank you very much. I'm gonna change the slide.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm a clean export product from Groningen, actually. So
We'll get that out of the way.
I better Jauke to convince me to return to Groningen. So I'm doing a good job so far. But yes, as Francisca mentioned, I live in Paris. I work for the OECD, and today I want to present some findings of our upcoming report on resourcing higher education in Portugal that I did with my colleagues in the Education and Skill Directorate. So I will be speaking mostly about education policies today, not so much about regional policies, but maybe that's good for a change. So the case of Portugal. So some of you may be familiar with some demographic trends in Portugal, but they have a very unbalanced population change pattern. So all the areas in green have lost population in the last decade, some of them quite rapidly, and you see the concentration of population in coastal areas, very imbalanced pattern. And the projections don't look great for interior regions. So you see by 2080, most TL2 regions are projected to face population decline, and the population will concentrate further in Lisbon, but most TL2s are expected to lose population. And for higher education, this particularly means that by 2080, you're going to have 1/3 less of the people aged 20 to 29 that are the ones that usually go to universities. It's already 1/3 in the reduction of the typical demand that you have for higher education. So what do you do about that? So there's 3 strategies here. The first one is that you have to diversify your educational offer, right? Try to draw from other pools. You see there the probability of attending university by age range. So like we talk about reskilling, upskilling, trying to broaden the demographics of people that attend university. You can broaden to international students, but for a country like Portugal, these 2 things combined probably are not going to be enough to balance the decline in the traditional student numbers. So we have to talk about shrinking the provision. So adapting the provision to this new scale. So you have now already today universities that are operating at excess capacity. Some of polytechnics, private universities have capacity for 100% and operating at 50%. And this is only going to get worse because those areas where there is excess capacity are the ones that are going to face a decline in the number of students. So something needs to be done about resizing to a new demand in countries that face such a strong population decline. Then you also can think of more flexible provision, and this can include 3 different types of things. The first one is digital provision of education to also expand the horizons of your provision beyond your local borders. The second one there is to have shorter programs. So for instance, short cycles, micro credentials, not the typical, rethink your educational offer to offer more different programs that cater to different publics. And the third one is to be flexible, for instance, in having networks of universities, so operating, for instance, in terms of satellite campuses or, more lean provision to take into account these new trends. So the second part, brain circulation. We talked about quite a bit of that here, and I have to fully agree with the statement that it is not about retaining the local youth. So any youth is as good as the local youth in terms of bringing demand to regions. And you already see it in the patterns of migration of people that attend higher education in Portugal. There is a lot of circulation across the country, and this makes sense because it is unlikely that your local university will match your preference. That's the case for everybody. So some people move because the program offer that is next to their door is not what they're looking for, or they move in search of higher quality. And this is when things can become problematic. So if there are huge differences in quality across, you cannot blame people for moving to the better universities that they can access. So there you see, for instance, it's a pretty interesting case of mobility because people think that maybe Lisbon and Porto are sucking in all the talent from the rest of the country. But what is actually true is that they are providing mostly for their functional urban areas. So already 3/4 of people that attend university in Lisbon are made up of the local functional urban area demand. So it is not so much about that. And you see places like Évora that has, some of you may know, a traditional university, pretty large, but already in a place like that, half of the students don't attend university in Évora. So you see how something has to be done with the level of attraction of places in the interior. Why? Because for a place like Lisbon and Porto, they have their demand, pretty automatic from the mass that's around them. But for places like Évora, it is going to become even harder to attract people from their surrounding areas because those will be emptying out. So they have to attract people from a broader and broader range, geographical range. How do you do that? By offering quality programs and by specializing. And this is the key part here. How do we form a coherent, high quality educational programs across all universities? And this depends on how much universities coordinate with each other. You can be completely prescriptive and say the national government will say you do X and you do Y, and you don't step in each other's toes. That's one extreme. The other extreme is that you let universities completely determine the program offer. But if they don't have any incentives to collaborate, what happens is there's a lot of replication of programs and the quality goes down. So the Netherlands is a great example of how coming together into networks of university, for instance, align with research objectives, priorities for the country, and then trickling down to a better program offer might help. But it needs to be put in place. It will not happen automatically. And the last point here is spread quality, not capacity. This is because in Portugal, up to the last government, there was a policy to incite, let's call it like that, incentivize students to go to interior regions. So there are grants that are provided if you move to a university in the interior. And these are grants that are not available for people living in metropolitan areas. So maybe that also explains why so many people in Lisbon attend university in Lisbon, but they are discriminating depending on the place where the person is born. And this we think is probably not the best strategy. Probably better to think of a system that is progressive, a system that allows mobility of students across the country with sufficient financial support for all of those that want to move, even those that want to move out of urban areas. You also have to provide that, because in a system like this, combined, for instance, with policies that were restricting the number of study places in universities in Lisbon and Porto, because they thought that these universities were becoming too large. So one way was to say, let's restrict the study places there and give more money to interior universities. So this a policy like that can end up excluding the urban poor, because you create more competition for less places in the place with most demand. And on top of that, you don't provide financial support for the urban poor, immigrants, etc., to move universities somewhere else. You end up effectively creating a more unequal system. So you really have to think it through in terms of spatial policies and how much this is about also interpersonal inequalities. And the last point, just to finish, you see there the relationship between accessibility to higher education, physical accessibility, and job outcomes. So what we all should expect, all the geographers in the room, urban metropolitan areas have more jobs. Therefore, if you study in an area like that, your chances of getting a job are higher. That's fine. But what's interesting is what happens in the places with low accessibility. And it's not a black and white story. Not if you are small, you will immediately have graduates that have less chances of working. This changes a lot across small places. So it is about reducing this variance, because this talks about a variance in the quality of provision. So if you happen to be born in a small place next to establishment that is not so good, you will maybe finish a degree but not find a job. And then maybe the quality of your degree will not be well perceived in the rest of the country. Then it's also your geographical mobility, even if you have a high university degree. But if you're lucky enough, you were born in a small place, but they happen to have a very good higher education establishment, and you're fine. So what we see here also that is key in our interviews with the higher education institutions in Portugal is some of the ones that have the good job outcomes are the ones that make more of an effort to connect with the local employers. So this smart specialization, if you want to call it, fancy term for something very simple, but like Polytechnic of Bragança, is very linked to the SME sector in the region. They hear what they need, they work together with them, they even provide some funding, they try to solve issues like accommodation, etc. So it's a very close-knit relationship that ensures that in a place that has limited jobs, your graduates are going to make it and are well perceived also in the rest of the country. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much. You were nodding a lot. It seemed to me that it was almost too much agreement there, so I'm going to try to steer it up a bit. One of the key questions that we started with is to somehow that there is an underlying assumption that depopulation is bad for the regions. So I'm going to ask you, is it bad for the regions or for the young people because they might not be linked to their family anymore? So it's net out migration bad for the young people or for the region?
And would that mean that we should reduce the mobility of people at an early stage to not even leave their region? And you're also, of course, invited to answer the questions, but also respond to each other's presentations.
Yeah, I think that's a very crucial question. I think for the individual perspective, it's good not to try to keep young people who have the talent to stay in the region. On the other hand, it comes with a cost because indeed you are not close to your family anymore. But especially in a small country like the Netherlands, it's not very far away. So I think for the Netherlands, it's not really a social problem because you can easily travel to your family when you want. So therefore, I think it's good to stimulate people to try to get the highest degree possible.
Thinking about depopulation, I think there is one clear victim of depopulation, and it's a very small group of people, but they're very vocal. They're politicians in those regions because they see their potential voters dropping, they see their potential funding transfers dropping, and they hate it because they like votes and they like funding. But for the general population, it's much more complicated. I mean, there's two questions there. Is it a problem? And if it is a problem, can we fix it? I'm actually fairly convinced that it's not something we can fundamentally alter. If you look at Portugal, some regions have been losing population for 50 years. To think that with a small change in policy or a little bit of more investment, we can change those long-term trends, I think is very, very naive. And I don't think it's necessarily an appropriate policy goal to really want to fundamentally alter where people live in a country. I think I would give precedence to the individual decisions. Of course, our investment decisions will influence that to some degree, but the goal of our investment decisions or our policy shouldn't necessarily be a different distribution of population. It should be a higher quality of life or a higher economic performance or higher income. And that can happen in multiple ways with distributions of population. Last thing I'll say is, one thing that changes there is a life cycle element to migration. Young people move to cities, but they don't stay young. At a certain point, they become middle-aged, they might have kids, they might move to the suburbs. At a certain point, they do retire, and then often they move further away. So actually, your share of young people exaggerates the amount of population growth you would expect in a large city, and exaggerates the amount of population decline you will find in a rural area, because when people become older, they often move back. So I don't think we should excessively focus on young people. And that's not because I'm no longer young, but because we have data that demonstrates that people do move around in a different way after a certain time.
Yes, fully agree with that point. So maybe on Jauke's presentation, you stop at a certain age, then the question is, do they ever return and why? So I believe also in this life cycle kind of perspective, but from local and regional point of view, I think the scenario where you have extremely unbalanced pyramids is also problematic because it can lead to tipping points on the points of no return. So, you know, losing working age population, it has an effect on your fiscal front, so your ability to collect taxes, to implement policies. So this can lead to vicious circles. So like when it becomes really unbalanced, that a region or a place is losing most of their youth, they're also losing working age population in a way, and therefore their ability to collect taxes. So that can be problematic if it happens like that, and then you can wait for people to return, but then in the meantime, what happens, you know, who's going to finance that place so that it can remain attractive? So that's probably one of the questions we're going to tackle in our new project on shrinking regions. So that's one thing. And then I think it's even more problematic to see young people not moving, if that signals that you have a very exclusive system. So for instance, if it's extremely selective migration, you see the youth are staying behind, but they're not entering higher education, but they're also not working. They're being left behind. They're staying in the region, but that is not necessarily a good sign. So this is why here, when we talk about, you know, reconcentrating, provision, etc., we're also careful to say that you have to have a very good small base of, for instance, vocational schools, technical schools, so anything that can link this youth to the local labor market that is not necessarily the highest levels of education, the most specialized, but it's very important to keep that base and to keep track of what's happening to all the youth, especially those not moving.
So you can already start thinking if you want to ask a question. I'm going to turn to you in just a second. I would like, before I turn to the audience, just ask if it's still the case that people actually move back to the countryside because they've made their living in the city. They have gotten kids in the meantime that grew up in the cities. Are they likely to move to the countryside and not see their grandkids? Or is that something, a pattern that's dying out and not going to reproduce itself over the next decades?
So when we look at net migration patterns by age in Europe, we definitely still see a pattern that net migration of the age group 65 plus into rural regions is positive. Don't know, I can't speculate about the relationship with their grandkids, but I can say that the data confirms this pattern. But something that Anna said, I wanted to respond to as well. There is this issue of scale. Most of the analysis I presented was at large regions, not 2 regions. And within those regions, you will find a lot of diversity. Some people, notably the World Bank, is a big fan of promoting migration, thinking that that will solve a lot of things, and that pumping money into less developed regions is a waste of time, and we should stop doing so very rapidly. I obviously disagree. But there is a tipping point. But that tipping point doesn't happen in a region of 1 million people or 500,000 people. It happens at a smaller scale. And given the very substantial population reductions we'll see in many member states, it is very likely that some small settlements, and I'm talking villages of a couple of hundred people, will be confronted with those kind of tipping points. And this is one of the reasons why the Spanish politicians are very concerned about this issue, because they have a lot of very small settlements that are reaching this kind of tipping point. So I do think it's an issue, but it's never an issue for an entire region or an entire country. It's much more local and small scale.
So I'm trying to offer eye contact so you can indicate to me that you would like to ask a question or make a comment. So far, no one has taken up the offer. Oh, there you go. Thank you very much. Vasily, please introduce yourself once.
Yeah, hi, Vasilis Panastagiotis from LSA. Hello, everybody. So I want to ask whether we should be thinking about sort of interventions that lead to education and individuals, or spatial interventions, spatial planning, basically. So the way I think about graduate migration, yeah, if somebody moves from Groningen to Paris, then they get a private return, but the social, they don't, internalize the social cost, but they live, a brain drain effect back in Groningen, not necessarily Groningen, but in the descending region. On the other hand, people who move, we know they do better matches, so there's more productive jobs. Yeah. So in the first case, we have to tax them because they don't internalize the cost. In the second case, we have to subsidize them because they produce positive externalities. Somewhere in the middle, we leave them alone, don't tax them, don't treat them. Then the issue of the population then is clearly not the issue of the individual, because at the individual level, people, we believe, optimize, act rationally. So then it is, if I see at the macro scale, because as Chloe was saying, okay, if it's at a very, very micro scale, a small village, then it's a completely different policy. But if I see that, North Netherlands, for example, does get depopulated, then it is about thinking about my system of cities and how they connect functionally. So would the panel agree that this is not, is there a message to be said that this is not about sort of education policy or individual level treatment, but spatial planning?
Thank you. Before I return to you, is there another question or comment that I can take up? No, then yes, Evelyn.
Thank you. I would like to ask also about the need for tertiary education, and also that there seems to be kind of inflation of those kind of education levels. And we saw that it is increasing everywhere. And also recently we had in the Netherlands a kind of discussion about more and more people getting university degrees, for example, but even some of the companies, they don't request that anymore because they might, instead of university degrees, they'd rather have people that have skills that they really need, and which can be programming skills, but also skills working in the construction sector, which is also increasingly getting complex, for example. And I think, Anna, you already mentioned also something about it, so you need to have it at multiple levels, but perhaps could you also respond to that?
That's fantastic. That was my backup question. So can I hand over to you?
I'll start with the Vasili's questions about spatial planning. We have been looking into the settlement network. So what's the role of cities, towns, and villages in different locations, something we're doing together with the OECD. And I think that settlement network is very important because it is often the location of the provision of important services, be they, healthcare or education, but also private services. And so when you're confronted with a substantial reduction of your population, that settlement network is going to be affected, and it's not something that will automatically adjust. And so, for example, what the OECD recommended in Japan is that they actively try and strengthen some of the nodes in that settlement network and agree with, the local population, local politicians, which settlements are likely to disappear. This is a painful process, but I think it's a better process than the alternative, where all the settlements lose population and many of them may be faced with a tipping point. Whereas if you can maintain some of them and then try and reconcentrate population in some of the remaining settlements, you may actually end up with a higher level of service provision than you would without intervention. So even though the process might be somewhat uncomfortable, I would hope that the end result is a positive one.
Yes, to follow up on Vasili's question, you could have spatial policies that aim to, for instance, rebalance territories, and with a lot of emphasis on higher education. This is what Portugal was attempting before. So, providing grants for students to move to the interior, that didn't work. Providing additional funding to university interior, even though they have excess capacity. So this clear spatial policies, not personal policies, but it did not necessarily lead to the intended outcomes. So like what you had was students moving as proximate as the policy allowed them close to Lisbon. So instead of ended up in the real interior, they ended up in Centro and the coastal areas ones. To the limits, it's actually a really nice self-organization example, but to the limits of what the policy allowed them, still benefit from the proximity to cities. So you cannot go against these currents, and I think there's maybe too much emphasis on how much of the problems can be blamed in the tertiary educated and how much role they can have in overturning things. So like it is for those that left the region and are not educated to come back and rebuild it, and this is sort of thinking, but it is in reality, you need just a package of integrated policies that make sense. So if there are jobs for them and it makes sense in terms of income, and they, in the meantime, also recover, for instance, the social family connections, that's great. But to ask them to go without anything else in place makes no sense. So it is about mostly more than spatial, I would say spatial integrated, because it has to also take into account what's happening with the jobs and the rest of the region in terms of, for instance, service provision, etc., housing. It cannot be separated.
I have some doubts about spatial planning as an instrument. I think it also depends on the preferences of people. During COVID, we learned that you can work from home, and even 2 or 3 days per week. That means it has consequences for your location, because it's not necessary to go every day to the office from 9 to 5. Of course, it's not valid for all occupations, but in the Netherlands, we saw that in holiday destinations, there was a high occupation because people work from holiday occupations. I think there were even 5,000 people from the Netherlands who worked from the Canary Islands, but their employer didn't know. And they didn't. So I think there is a tendency that the relation between the work and the residential location becomes more flexible. And we see that already also in location patterns and in housing prices in the Netherlands, that it spreads more out. And of course, you don't want to be in complete isolation, but the Netherlands is small, but you need good connections. I think in 2014, there was an OECD study which advocated to the Dutch government to connect the functional economic areas better. And that means you can spread the population more equally over the country without losing really the agglomeration effects. And you can avoid some congestion effects which are negative. And that is related to spatial planning, but first of all to the behavior of workers, but also of firms. Did they accept that their workers are farther away?
Fantastic. I had a look at the time and we are already at the stage where I have to ask you to make your last statement. So the obvious question now is, we've discussed some of the problems, but can I ask you to suggest what you think policy should prioritize? What should policy making do?
And from my end, I would say, coming back to the point of quality, so it's the most important thing to ensure inclusion, territorial or otherwise. So reducing quality differences in the educational system, making it more coherent and more aligned with the present and future demand is very important. And for that, there's a lot of institutional work that has to happen between universities, universities in connections with the regions, with the Ministry of Higher Education, etc. So lots of work, it can be done, like the Netherlands example is a very good one of that it can be done. There's a lot of different interests that clash, but if institutions have the right incentives and you have a plan and you face your faith, let's say, this can really help with inclusion at all scales.
Feels slightly uncomfortable saying this as somebody who works for the Commission, saying that we need to reduce economic disparities. But I would actually, for local politicians, advocate not focusing on economic differences, but focusing on differences in quality of life. And I think in places that are losing population, it's even more important to maintain or improve quality of life. And that should be the metric people are judged by, not whether they repopulate their shrinking region, which is unlikely to work and going to cost a lot of money. If the people who live there say, hey, we've made sure that this has not undermined my quality of life, and actually it's better now, I think you're in a much better position then to continue to make sure that that place remains attractive.
Yeah, unfortunately, I agree with you is that you should focus on quality of life. And I think what we should not forget is, of course, there are some groups in the area with population decline who have less good circumstances, but also in cities. I think within cities, the problem of these groups might be even bigger than if you live in the countryside, where you have maybe a better home, a cleaner environment, you have a garden where you could grow your own vegetables, instead of being in the city. So we should not forget that these groups are not only in areas with population decline.
So thank you very much. First of all, to the audience in the room, also to the audience out there in the world somewhere. Thank you for joining us. Yes, let's have a wave into the camera. And thank you, of course, to the three speakers for taking this time, and to the RSA for organizing the winter conference. My conversations in the break have suggested that everyone was enjoying to see each other again, to make new friends. So now I would like to invite you to take up those lovely conversations, these informal conversations over lunch. Thank you again.